Welcome to Lone Star Gun Talk, ladies and gentlemen. I am your host, Derek Wills, as always, and we have a special treat for you. I've been teasing it for the past couple of weeks, and today is the day. I have on the line here Representative Phil King, and he's been gracious enough to come on the program, answer some tough questions, and then have a discussion about next session. And we're really excited. Representative King, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Just delighted to be here.
Well, I really appreciate your time. I want to go just a little bit into what happened last session. I don't want to spend too long on it because my focus is next session. But tell me a little bit about what happened with the discussion from AG Paxton's office regarding the constitutional carry bills of last session.
Great. Glad you asked that question. First off, during the heat of the legislative session, things get kind of confused and sometimes things look a little different than they actually were. First, let me say Ken Paxton is a very dear friend. We talk often. We served in the House together. We still stayed good friends. I'm delighted that his wife is running for the Senate. That's going to be great for the state of Texas. So, unknown to me, actually, buried in the family code is a provision that allows the Attorney General, I believe it's the family code, allows the Attorney General's office. Now, the Attorney General's office is responsible for child support collection in the state of Texas. It's a huge undertaking. I forget how many tens of millions of dollars of child support they collect through court proceedings and direct intervention every year. But it's a large operation. Well, unbeknownst to me and probably most other people, one of the things they can do is withhold various licenses that are issued by the state of Texas. And one of those was your license to carry. So early on in the session, when the two constitutional carry bills were initially filed, I was approached by the governmental affairs personnel for the Attorney General's office. And those are the people that interact with the legislature on different bills. They spend all their time reviewing the bills and coming and talking to the various authors and committee folks with any concerns or any thoughts. They came and they said that we're concerned that this would prohibit us from being able to use withholding a license as an enforcement tool to collect child support. I said, well, how serious is it to you? And they said, it's a very serious concern. I said, okay. And I directed them. I said, you need to go talk to the bill authors, let them know about that, and see if y'all can work something out that's satisfactory to the authors and to the AG's office. Time went on. I also filled the authors in that on myself. And I said, I understand this is a very serious concern of that. I think I mentioned it in committee a few times. Anyway, at the end of the day, it was taken out of both of the bills, or one of the bills. As I recall, later on, this I would not as I recall. Obviously, this became an issue, and then I was approached by the Attorney General's office, and they said we have reconsidered this, and it is no longer a concern. And so I said, okay, since this has been so public, and frankly, since I've been getting beat up on it, and you're the ones that requested it, I'm going to ask you to come in and testify before the committee and explain that it is no longer a concern. And if it's not a concern to y'all, it's not a concern to me.
So this happened before Steve Peer testified before the committee meeting.
Yeah, it was the few days before that.
Okay.
So, so the governmental affairs officer, Steve Peer, he's a very fine and sharp gentleman. He came in and testified first thing that morning, and he explained to the committee that it was no longer a concern of the Attorney General, that they had reconsidered that and withdrew any opposition to that aspect of the bill. And I said, let me clarify. If I remember, you can go back and listen to the archive, but I made sure they were very, very clear on that. And I said, fine, we'll withdraw that as an issue. But he came there at my request because it becomes such a public issue. And as I recall in the hearing, I said, so you are confirming that this was an issue that you had brought to me and to the bill authors? Yes, sir, it was. And you're now saying that the AG's office has reconsidered this and that it's no longer a concern. That is correct. Thank you. And from that moment on, it was no longer a concern and was no longer an issue for either of the bills.
Okay. Was this issue the reason that you didn't bring either bill up for a vote the week after testimony on it, because I think there was a week or two delay before you finally brought one up for a vote.
I think there was at least a couple of weeks there. No, not really. I mean, there's a time frame. These were massive bills. Massive's not the right word. They were very substantive bills. A
Uh-huh.
lot of pages, a lot of issues, and it's very rare, almost unheard of, for a bill to be voted out the very next week after a committee hearing. There's usually amendments to it. There's usually adjustments. The bill authors need to go around and make sure they've got the votes for it on committee. And there's other bills stacking up. We had hundreds of bills. I forget the total number, but well over 100 bills filed in our committee, and uncounted amendments that kind of worked their way through that process and revision. So waiting 2 or 3 weeks, what I did make sure happened and did happen was that a bill uh, was voted out of committee in plenty of time for it to come to the House floor. And also, when it came to the House floor, it came as an open product. In other words, it came where it could be amended in whatever manner the members of the House so chose to do. It could have been completely substituted with, for example, Jonathan Stickland's full constitutional carry bill if the members of the House on the floor voted to approve that. It could have been amended incrementally, one way or the other, but it came totally unrestricted and available for the House members to take it to wherever they wanted to take it before it would be up for a final vote.
Were the AG's concerns that were raised, is that the reason that you initially brought HB 1911 for a vote as opposed to HB 375?
No, there were other reasons. We had, and I'm not saying this in criticism of either of the authors at all. Uh, but but I believe Jonathan Stickland would and has said himself that his bill, he knew, would never actually get to the floor because of some issues involving Jonathan. I'm not criticizing him or anything like that. I'm just saying that he knew that his bills would not get to the floor. I don't know that he had any get to the floor all session, and that was due to something totally unrelated to constitutional carry. So the only bill that had a possibility of ever getting out of the calendars committee and getting to the floor was James White's. I think, I had encouraged James and Jonathan to work together on a draft. And as I understand it, Jonathan was prepared, if James just came to the floor, if 1911 came to the floor, to offer a full floor substitute, which would have been back to Jonathan's bill. And the members of the House would have had the opportunity to vote on that.
Interesting. Well, I could spend all day on the past, and I don't want to do that. I could argue the semantics, but that's not going to change what happened. So let's move forward. You have filed paperwork to become speaker. It just came out recently that Joe Strauss is not seeking reelection. So, and also a few others have just recently, like immediately after that news story hit, there were a couple others that have filed to become speaker. Why do you want to become speaker?
Well, I think I really want to change the way that the House operates. If you look over the last several decades, well, the House has always been the people's body. Senate's a little bit different. The Senate is led by the lieutenant governor, who's a statewide elected official. The senators have much larger territories than we do, about 5 times larger. The House at the federal level and the House in Texas was intended originally to be the people's Congress, the people's House. But as often happens with government, power accumulates. And what has happened in the Texas House over decades is that the power has shifted, the control has shifted from the individual 150 members to the Speaker's office, to where the Speaker's office, the office of Speaker, now virtually controls everything within the House. Tremendously powerful position. But yet he's not a statewide elected official, and that's really not the way our founders intended the House to operate. What I want to do is turn that bus around and push the power out of the Speaker's office and back down to the individual members of the House. And the neat thing about that, Derek, is when you empower the members of the House, you also empower their voters, empower their constituents. And that's what I want to try to do. There's a number of steps that we can talk about that I've already laid out publicly that I think need to be done in our state constitution and in our rules that will not just change that for the time that I would be speaker, but ensure that that power remains vested with the members and not the speaker for many speakers to come.
So basically, what you're saying is that um, you don't anticipate Joe Strauss hanging out in the wings, still kind of running things, even though he's no longer an elected official.
Oh no, I don't anticipate that at all. And um, some things that I would like to do, for example, is I want to put a term limit on how many sessions you can serve as a speaker. I've suggested 3 terms and putting that in a constitutional amendment, state constitutional amendment. Some have suggested 2. That would be okay too. It's really what the members of the House prefer, 2 or 3, but no more than that, because the longer you stay in that leadership position, the longer it allows you to accumulate more and more power. Same thing with our committee chairs. I want those rotated periodically so that there's not too much power invested in one committee chairman. I want full transparency in the way we pick our committees with seniority, because right now that's something that I believe, and I don't believe, I know, is often very manipulated. But I want to give members full power to exercise the seniority that their voters have sent them there to do. Number of other things, but at the end of the day, what happens is when you empower the members, then you remove a lot of the blocks, and when you've got a bill that has a lot of support, it's going to end up getting to the floor. It's not going to be stopped by the speaker's office or others that has put in place as a roadblock.
Okay. So, on a personal level, what are your feelings towards the Second Amendment and as it applies to the state of Texas? I've had a lot of dialogue with um, former state reps and current state reps that they kind of have an interpretation that I wouldn't really agree with. And I'm just curious. This is not me going to I'm not going to blast you on it, but I'm just curious as to how you personally feel the Second Amendment applies to the people of the United States, and specifically as it applies in the state of Texas.
Well, let me say this first, that I'm a gun person. I was a police officer for about 15 years, and then stayed a reserve for a couple of decades after that. So I'm technically a retired police officer. So I can carry everywhere, almost everywhere. I always do. I do that because I believe that not only do I have a right to self-defense, but I have a duty to defend others. And frankly, my police department spent a lot of time and money training me to do that, and I think that I can still do that if called upon. So I'm almost always packing. Now, I made sure that my kids grew up around guns and understanding how to use them as well as how to be safe with them. So, just at a personal level, it's very important to me and to my family. Now, at a legal perspective, I mean, the Constitution is the foundation of all our law in federal and state. The amendments were added to make sure that the federal amendments were added to make sure that there was no question that people had a right to bear arms and to self-defense, and so I I've always got, I think, an A+ rating from the NRA. I've carried gun bills, um, and so I feel very strongly about the need to support and defend the Second Amendment.
There's a bill filed in Congress, and this is the federal Congress that I'm talking about, that would ban or at minimum just regulate the bump stock accessories in the wake of the Las Vegas shooting. And depending on who you ask, this bill either has an endorsement or just very little opposition by the National Rifle Association. I'm curious, Representative King, as to how you would vote on such a bill if you were a member of the federal body.
Let me say first, I'm not completely sure I fully understand exactly what we mean when we say bump stock. I understand what it does. To be honest, had never actually heard of it until then. I'm kind of a pistol guy. And but but I will say this: I believe it's very reasonable, and I believe our founders today would have supported restricting the use of military grade hardware. We don't need to be issuing rocket propelled grenades or things like that. Those should remain at a different level because of the incredible damage they can do, because they are for an offensive rather than a defensive use, and because of the amount of training it takes to deal with those things. Now, so I've always felt that restricting fully automatic, it's really kind of a question. The semi-automatics that I've dealt with as a police officer, and then just personally, you can do incredibly rapid fire with those. And I recognize that a fully automated weapon, it will fire much, much faster. But in reality, there's not that much difference in terms of the amount of ammunition that you can unload in, say, a 60, in a 20 round magazine or 30 round magazine or something of that nature, whether it's fully or semi. You're still going to get it out in a very, very short period of time. So let me just say this: they would have to convince me that the bump stock took it to a level of being fully automatic
Okay.
for me to support that legislation.
Well, I clearly disagree, but I asked you for your opinion and you gave it, so I thank you for that. But now I want to shift to next session and constitutional carry. Constitutional carry, as we define it, is that an adult, a law abiding adult that is legally able to possess a firearm, has the ability to carry that on his person, either openly or concealed, and not have to worry about law enforcement detaining him simply because he is carrying. Now, I know that there is case law out there that prevents a law enforcement officer from detaining somebody for that. However, that's not something that most people know, and I would be willing to venture that it's not even something that most police officers know. And so I think it's important to make sure that we codify that aspect of it, that law enforcement cannot detain somebody simply because they are carrying and otherwise acting in a law abiding way. And I would also like to see campus carry expanded to basically include all of that. I personally, I don't believe that any institution that is operated or otherwise run by the government has the authority to dictate who can and cannot carry on their premises. And there seems to be a common acceptance, um, even that courthouses all across the country in every state, they ban firearms. And I don't think that that's technically correct. I don't think that that is something that the state governments even have the authority to do. So I would like to see where people can carry expanded. I'd like to see state mandated gun free zones taken away. For instance, like 51% establishments is perfectly um, possible for somebody to go into a bar and not get intoxicated and even not drink and carry a weapon on them. Now, if the business owner wants to prohibit them, then that's a whole nother issue. But essentially, that's what I would like to see the constitutional carry bill for next session look like. And I'm kind of wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I think you have to divide it into 3 locations. So let's try to do that. Let's take government owned or managed facilities, privately owned or managed facilities, and then just out in the open. So I would say that if it's a private, my house, if you come to my house, you're welcome to have a pistol. At the same time, if you come to my house and I don't want you to have a pistol, I can tell you it's my right and my full authority to tell you you cannot come in my house if you're armed. As the owner of that property, that's my property right.
Absolutely agree.
Okay, so feel the same way about it. I get kind of concerned about some of our businesses, and I want to clarify that a little bit too. But as a general rule, if it's my restaurant and I own it, I don't want people there with guns. That's my business because I own that restaurant.
Also
Now I
agree.
get a little. I now public parking. I've had arguments with some of the large employers who don't allow their people to drive to work with a gun, leave it in the car, which makes them drive to work and leave work without the ability to be armed. And I don't think an employer should have the authority to do that. But that's a little bit more narrow issue. So if it's a privately owned place, hey, the owner rules. If it's a government building, I think for us not to allow weapons in there, you need to have a really, really, really good reason. For example, I was a cop. I worked at a jail. People shouldn't be able to bring guns into a jail. There's obvious reasons for that, right? There's bad guys at jails.
Hmm.
We have we have um, the Texas Tech police officer was shot and killed just a couple of weeks ago in their police station. There's just certain places that where bad guys are that you have to have protection.
Right, and I
And I, but I,
assume I'm sorry to interrupt, but I assume you're talking about the secured area of a police station, correct?
secured area of a police station. I think every situation, I think every facility is different. It's hard to draw a strict line for that.
Right.
So, but I think the general rule is that you should be able to carry your gun if you're legally carrying, whatever the law is. If you can lawfully carry, you should be able to carry it in that government building, unless there is a compelling reason to prohibit it. And each place there may be different reasons because of the, again, like a jail, for example, or a sheriff's department or a police department. You gotta, it's just there's going to be different rules for different places. But the overarching rule is they're public facilities. Just because they're public facilities owned or operated by the government doesn't automatically mean be that you should be able to ban firearms there, like a state university or state college. Just because they're publicly owned, that doesn't mean they should automatically be banned. Now, out in open areas, right now, in the state of Texas, you can have any kind of handgun or rifle or shotgun in your car at any time, pretty much any place. You can walk up and down the street with a rifle or a shotgun downtown Fort Worth, wherever you're at. You'll draw some attention. That's why most people don't do it, but you can legally do that. You can also, if you have your license to carry, or if you're a retired police officer like me, you can carry that gun open if you want. You can carry a handgun in and out of public places, and that's perfectly legal and fine. So I think when we're talking about the constitutional carry issue or unlicensed carry, whichever you want to call it, I think you're really talking about really some pretty narrow things. How much should they be able to restrict your access to a government-owned facility or operated facility, and how much should you be restricted from carrying in a public in a public place? So I think that's really the areas that we're talking about. That both of those bills, 1911 and I forget the number of the other one, but 375 were intended to address.
Okay. Now, one thing that it wasn't brought up in either bill. It's just something that I've been kind of mulling over the past few years is 30-06 and 30-07. And, I understand property rights. I am a big proponent of property rights. And even though I don't agree with somebody's right to ban firearms on their property, I do support their legal means to do so. What I don't necessarily agree with is that we have in the penal code two specific statutes that only apply to otherwise law abiding citizens. And I say that because walking past one, you are essentially breaking the law. What rubs me wrong about them is that they're misdemeanor charges because all you're doing is essentially a minor trespass. If you were to walk past a 30-06 or 30-07 sign with the sole intention of robbing the place or murdering people or anything like that, no grand jury is even going to look at the misdemeanor charge of walking past that sign. They're going to focus
Without question.
Right. They're going to
Yes.
look at every single felony that you just committed. And so I have a problem with the just walking past that sign and in by technicality, the way the law is written is that the store owner doesn't even technically have a say in whether or not to press charges. If an officer sees you open carrying past a 30-07 sign, he can technically arrest you on the spot for breaking that. Or it'd be a class C, so it'd be a $200 or a $500 fine rather. What I would like to see is essentially a completely rework of that. Maybe get rid of 30-07 altogether. Make 30-06 say that it's only an offense if you are asked to leave by an authority of the establishment and you refuse to do so. Because at that point, I would say I would be more comfortable with the fact that it's now actually trespassing. There are many.
Yeah, I think
Go
I
ahead.
think that's perfect. I think that's perfectly reasonable. And you mentioned that to me the other day, and I think that's really a good idea. The way a lot of these, you always heard there's two things you don't want to see made: law and sausage. The way that 30-06 and 30-07 and so many of the laws dealing with firearms, the reason they're so confusing sometimes is because that we've got a lot of different opinions in the House. You got 150 members of the House, 31 members of the Senate. You've got a governor engaged in the process and a lieutenant governor engaged in the process. And there's a lot of difference of opinions. And a lot of people weren't like you and me. They didn't grow up around firearms. And so they're particularly uncomfortable. And so what happens a lot of times is a bill, I'll just say maybe a 30-06 type bill is thrown out that makes a lot of sense the way it's drafted. But by the time it gets through the process and is amended to get it passed, to get the votes for it, it ends up being a little bit convoluted, sometimes having legislative drafting errors. I mean, a lot of things happen as it goes through that very confusing process of passing out of the House and passing out of the Senate. So a lot of times that bills will be filed in a very clean and succinct fashion, but by the time they get through to get to the votes, they've been amended and weakened in some way. That was a lot of the process that brought about 30-06 and 30-07. It was there were compromises that took place to get the bills passed at the time. Same thing with campus carry. That took multiple runs at the legislature, and finally, getting it down to what was a much weaker version initially than was initially filed. So I think that's part of the problem. The idea that you should be asked to leave, because I'll be honest with you, of course, I don't always look for the signs because I got the retired peace officers deal, so I'm not subject to them. But I walk by them all the time and don't notice them. And I remember sometimes going in and thinking, I wonder if there was a sign out there because somebody may look at me kind of funny.
Mhm. No, I have definitely run into that too, where I have I typically open carry, but sometimes I conceal. I've walked into a business and I honestly did not see the signs. Nobody said anything to me. Nobody even gave me a look. And there are times where people didn't even notice that I'd had a 1911 on my hip, which I don't know how that happens. But I walk out, and as I'm walking out, I see the sign, and I'm just thinking, oh, well, there it is.
Well, I'll give you even a better example. Now, we fixed this, but we had one of the members of the legislature 4 or 5 sessions ago leaving Austin, went out to the Austin airport, forgot they had their pistol in their briefcase. Guess what happened?
Mhm.
Yeah, and it was a pure accident. They went through it. There they are as a legislator. Those folks knew they weren't going to commit a crime.
Right.
And the then sitting DA, not the current one, took away their license to carry for a year, put them on probation, and did a bunch of other things. And it was just an accident. They just forgot to take it out of their suitcase or whatever it was when they went through security.
Right.
So I mean, those are you can do that at store. And that's why I think it makes perfect sense what you suggested a couple of weeks ago when we talked. Makes perfect sense to require someone to actually say, "Hey, sir, you're not supposed to be in here." And if you go, "Oh man, forgot I had it on my hip," or "I missed your sign," that you turn around and can walk out, everything should be fine.
No, I agree. What are your thoughts on allowing people to carry inside a 51% establishment, assuming the establishment owner allows it?
Mixed emotions, and to be honest, I'm open to that, but I really need to think through it, and we really need to do some iron sharpening iron to make sure that's the right thing. And this goes back to my 15 years as a police officer. I had some um, difficult experiences related to bars and guns, and so I know, and you know, and everybody who's listening knows that alcohol and firearms are the worst mix ever. And so really have to think through that. I think that because the obvious thing is, what if someone's going in, they're not going to drink, they're just hanging out with some buddies and watching the game on the big screen or something like that. Are people around them going to be intoxicated? Do you say? I just would really have to think through that a lot.
Mm-hmm.
The larger question is, could you ever get it passed? I don't know the answer to that either.
Well, that's another thing, and that actually is a good segue into what I want to go into next. You and I discussed briefly about the, I guess, unofficial policy of the House to not necessarily move bills forward until you have a majority co-sponsor on the bill. That way, you know that you have the votes, correct?
Well, yes and no. If it's something really controversial or high, or uh, if it's a major bill, a lot of controversy is associated with it, or a lot of attention, sometimes that's the rule. But a lot of things get to the floor without someone knowing that they've really got all the votes for it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I don't want to put you on the spot with this. I mean, we're still a long ways off from session, even coming close to beginning. You still have an election and all that fun stuff. But should you become speaker, would it be too much of me to ask that you commit to at least pushing for a constitutional carry bill to get to the floor for a vote, regardless of how many co-sponsors it has? Because in my mind, that that's a bit more transparent. And even if it fails, we can at least understand where our elected officials stand on the issue, and they can have a chance to uh, explain why they voted the way that they did. But I think that if we really want a more transparent House, a more transparent state government, then issues like this should be pushed forward. So if you do become speaker, would you be able to commit to at least pushing to get this to the floor for a vote, regardless of the amount of co-sponsors?
Yeah, let me answer that very clearly. First, let me say that had I been speaker this last session, 1911, because of the interest that was in it and the support that was there for it, I felt like it had it. I would have allowed it come to the floor. In my opinion, it had earned the right as an issue to make it all the way to the floor for a full debate. And so if I had been speaker, it would have made it to the floor for a full debate. I don't know for sure that it would have passed. And if it passed, I don't know what it would have looked like when it did. I don't know what kind of amendments would have been put on it. But had I been speaker, I believe it earned the right as an issue to get to the floor where there could be a full debate. I have a lot of confidence in the legislature to debate things, iron sharpens iron, and to come up with good solutions. And on the floors where you do a lot of that. So I'll say that if the issue arises next session, and if there is the level of interest that there was in it this last session from so many members, then it's going to have earned the right to come to the floor for debate.
Okay. Is there any reason in particular you don't feel the same, or you didn't feel the same way about 375 from last session?
You know, one thing to remember too is that one thing I feel strongly about for a speaker, whether I agree with a bill or disagree with a bill, really doesn't come into play as to whether or not it actually gets to the floor. In other words, as speaker, there's going to be bills passed out that I may not really like, but there'll be bills passed out that obviously I do like. But just because I'm speaker, that doesn't give me the authority to say that a bill can't move forward. What gives a bill the right to move forward is the fact that the members of the House have worked it through the committee process. A committee passed it out saying this deserves the right to be heard on the floor. It comes to the floor, and then the members have the opportunity to debate it, amend it, and pass it out if that's what they wish to do. I have a lot of confidence in the legislature to do the right thing when they are given the opportunity to debate issues. So, um, and I'm sorry, could you ask the question one more time? I lost my train of thought there a little
It's
bit.
okay. I was asking why you said that you felt that 1911 had earned the right to get to the floor. Is there a reason that you didn't feel the same way about 375?
Well, as I mentioned with 375, it because of some unique things with regard to the author, and I'm not criticizing him at all. He'll tell you this too, but the odds of it passing would have been very, very slim. But you know, it just wasn't going to get anywhere. 1911 actually had a possibility of getting to the floor.
Okay. Well, I have one other question, and this was something that you actually raised in committee last session as a concern, and it was the provision in 375 that would have allowed 18-year-olds to exercise their right to carry without a permit, but it also mandated that to get a permit you had to be 21. Would you support a provision that would allow 18-year-olds to carry without a permit as long as the provisions to get a license maintained to be 21 because we don't want to mess up a reciprocity agreement?
And let me restate what my concern was. 18-year-olds are kids in high school.
Mhm.
They, I know what I was like in high school. When I was a police officer, I wasn't able to be licensed until I was 21. And even then, I had to go through a lot of training. I had to go through a police academy. Then I had to be under continuing supervision for the first long number of months, actually for the first year out there. And same thing with the military. When you're in the military, the level of training you go through one-on-one before to qualify you to use a whatever type of weapon they're teaching you to use, long or handgun. And so I think there's just some things in life that require training. Driving a car, and they don't require training to protect the person that's using the weapon or carrying the weapon. They require training to protect other people from accidental misfires and things of that nature. And so my concern with 18-year-olds was, one, their level of maturity, and uh, with the absence of any training that, frankly, in our culture, kids get today. I mean, I learned how to shoot a rifle at summer camp. I mean, that's the way it was, then. But most kids don't have any access, and then we've got the gang issue and all the things. And so the 18-year-old was a real concern for me. Now, let's say a bill comes to the floor of the House with an 18-year-old in it. The members are going to get to vote and debate on that. Um, but that my concern is with their level of maturity. My concern is with their the fact that of kids carrying without having any training at all.
So you're still not sold on the idea.
It 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 bothers me. It deeply concerns me, having been someone who went through a lot of training with firearms. It very much concerns me for an 18-year-old in high school to be able to pack a pistol when he's going to his prom.
Mhm.
And it also concerns me that as long as we're going to have these 30-06 and 30-07 signs out there, how do people know what those mean if they didn't have some minimal training? Now, let me say this: the quality of training that we require to get an LTC is really not anything that's. I mean, I would not call that firearms training.
Neither would I.
I mean, at least they're getting some classroom on the right to use, where they can carry, what the signs mean, that type of thing. I mean, and I'll give you a real quick story, which is too long for a podcast, but I want to tell you it quickly anyway. When I was a police officer, we had two officer friends, and one night I hear a shots fired call, and they're in a restaurant at 2 o'clock in the morning in Fort Worth. And what had happened was they were sitting in a booth eating breakfast, and there were two gentlemen sitting behind them in another booth. One of them had a pistol in his coat pocket. It fell out. It was a cheap handgun, and it accidentally fell out of his pocket, hit the floor, and discharged and shot up through the table. Fortunately, it didn't hurt anybody. And of course, both my friends jump up, stand on the booth, drawing down on these guys because they didn't know what was going on until they got it settled. But my point being, that guy had no training, no experience at all in how to handle a firearm, and he almost got some people shot. Those kind of things happen. So I'm a big believer in training. The dilemma that I've had and always have with regard to firearms is how do you make sure that somebody's had proper training, not to prevent them from hurting themselves. I mean, if they want to take that risk, that's their risk, but to prevent them from an accidental discharge or other things that can happen that endanger other people. And that's always, and that's that dilemma. And that's why it's important for us to have those discussions and debates and try to figure a way through that.
Well, if you would allow me, I think that there is a solution to this. I have always been of the philosophy that there is a free market solution to just about everything. And I think that when private enterprise takes responsibilities upon it themselves to do something, they end up producing a better product in the end than any government mandate or government body could ever do. So I would say that the solution to that is to encourage organizations like Lone Star Gun Rights to push for both weapons safety training as well as what the law in Texas is. And there are other organizations that also do this. You know, you have Texas Law Shield, for instance, that holds gun law seminars all the time. Not only do they talk about Texas law, but they also talk about other state laws in order to prevent somebody who's traveling from getting into trouble. And I think that if organizations like mine, if organizations like Lone Star Gun Rights were able to focus more on the training aspect, then that's the perfect solution to the problem, because not only would there be a better outcome, you would have a more informed public, and you would have probably a more armed populace and a better trained populace. What do you think about that?
I think that you and I just had a very good discussion about a very important question. And you make some great points, and they're very compelling points. Let me point out this while we're right here. You know, last session, as we were kind of trying to work through these issues, there were very sincere questions being asked by legislators and by members of the public. And as we tried to kind of get through this, and it's so important that when those questions are asked, like I just said, okay, how do we deal with training? How do we deal with safety? And you came back with a very, very uh, intelligent answer, a very good response that makes a lot of sense. And you did that during the legislative session. One of the problems we kept running into, and it hurt the bills. One of the problems we kept running into is legislators would ask very sincere questions, or other members of the public would ask very sincere questions. And instead of getting the kind of mature, reasonable, intelligent response that you just gave, they would be shouted at. And it really hurt the process. Um, and so one thing that would really help us going forward into this next legislative session is for everybody to realize that when a legislator asks a question, that they're really looking for a solution, and they're really looking for a way to move things forward. Now, don't get me wrong, there's times people ask questions with an intent to try to stop something or block it. I get that. But most of the times, they're really just trying to figure this issue out. They may be from downtown Dallas, and really guns are just, they've never owned them, and they're just trying to kind of figure it out. So you gave a great answer. Your answer has a lot of reason and merit. And I think that that type of discussion can lead to a bill that could be very good for Texas.
Well, thank you very much for saying that. Do you have any questions or concerns for me or Lone Star Gun Rights that maybe you've had in the back of your mind since last session?
No, I think my hope is though that I know this issue is going to be back up in the next legislative session. I would hope that between now and then that the advocates and the people that authored the bill would try to think through the concerns that were raised, legitimate concerns or sincere concerns. Let me put it that way: sincere concerns that were raised by members of the legislature, and that they would be thinking through for creative ways to deal with those concerns, so that by the time the legislature convenes, the things that can be worked out already have been, and that the interim will be put to good use. Again, all we're really talking about, you can already have anything in your car, you can have anything in your home, anything in your private business. You know, the areas that we have firearms restricted, there's a lot of them, but in terms of those three categories: private, public buildings, private facilities, and open areas, uh, it's really pretty limited. So it's easy to identify the things we're trying to address. But I would think that you and groups like yours have a lot of opportunity over the next year to sit down with legislators and sit down with groups that are concerned and work out some things. You mentioned the training, coming up with some proposals for that for private programs to advocate training, make that training available to young people, make it available to anybody that wants it, promote it and push it in communities. You know, that's something that you would have the time over this interim to develop, and those kind of things mean a lot to legislators. They're looking for solutions, and and uh, and for and they're looking for good, open, frank, reasonable discussion.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Representative King. I'm going to wrap this up because we're well past 45 minutes now, and I don't want to take up any more of your time. But I do look forward to continuing this dialogue in the future, and thank you very much for coming on the program today.
Great, thank you.
Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, Representative Phil King. I know that there are some answers that he gave that you would have liked me to press him on, and there's a reason that I didn't do that. I wanted this interview to mainly focus on next session because there's nothing that we can do now to change the outcome of last session. Whether or not you agree with his answers or not, he gave them, I believe, honestly. And Lord knows there are answers that I did not agree with, that he was willing to give, regardless of his knowledge of how I felt about the issues. For instance, that bump stock thing. I am adamantly opposed to that. I think full auto should be perfectly legal for anybody. And I would be willing to go as far as saying that RPGs should be legal. But he doesn't agree. And all I asked for was his opinion on those, and he gave it. And I believe that he gave it honestly. We can sit here and criticize until we're blue in the face over the semantics of what happened last session, but again, it doesn't change anything. Whether or not he becomes the next speaker still remains to be seen. He still has to win an election. And there's still a long time out between now and January 8th, 2019, when the next session begins. My sincere hope is that starting discussions on this topic now can prevent the issues that we had from last session. There was a lot of misinformation going around. There was a lot of blatant lies going around. And there were some legitimate concerns that people had based on a misunderstanding of what the legislation actually did. I think that if we start this dialogue now and continue to have it between now and January of 2019, I think it will set us up very nicely for an almost perfect, if not perfect, constitutional carry bill, which is what we want. Part of the reason that we opposed 1911 as it was because if it passed as it was, the problems would take what we felt 20 years to fix. We want to get the perfect bill done now, and that's what I'm hoping to accomplish. If you enjoyed this discussion, please subscribe to the podcast using your favorite app, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and a myriad of others, to make sure that you get the latest episodes every Sunday of Lone Star Gun Talk. Until then, Lone Star Gunners, arm yourself with knowledge and share the ammo.